certainly there are limits to science. As an empiricist, which is what I am, empirically there are limits to what science can do. In fact, in my own field, cosmology, there are clearly limits because we have one universe to observe, and most of us live in that universe. The Republican Party in my country doesn't, so therefore, because of that, there may be many universes, and therefore there's obviously, in some real physical sense, a limited domain over which we can explore. And that's the key point. It's not just tools. Every academic discipline uses tools, and in some ways they're not that different. But the key part of what makes science and what makes it work is it's based on empirical evidence. Sort of rational thought applied to empirical evidence. And therefore, if you can't measure it, even in principle, I mean, there's lots of things we can't measure that we can talk about as a theoretical physicist. I think about things, a lot of things we can't measure right now. But if you can't ever measure it in principle, then science really has nothing to say about it. I would argue that anything else you tend to say about it is not worth much either. But if you can't ever measure it in principle, then science really has nothing to say about it. I would argue that anything else you tend to say about it is not worth much.
Am I right that you say that even if there are limits to science, and we may never know, then that doesn't provide any comfort to people advocating other ways of knowing? If science has limits, then maybe that's a general limit.
Let me say something that Massimo may jump on, just for the purpose of entertainment. I don't think there are other ways of knowing. If you talk about what knowing is, other ways of knowing are an illusion, in my opinion.
Right.
That ultimately, when you think about what you know, it doesn't come by revelation. It ultimately comes from some empirical basis. And of course, you can reflect on it and think about it and learn things based on that reflection, but it ultimately comes down to what you can measure. And therefore, I don't think there are other ways of knowing.
Right.
But it ultimately comes down to what you can measure, and therefore I don't think there are other ways of knowing.
Right. Do you think that science, no matter how you define it, or maybe it depends, has disproven or refuted God's existence?
Well,
do you think that God is a scientific hypothesis?
You can't disprove an unprovable hypothesis.
Right. That's an interesting answer.
But you can render it so preposterously unlikely that anybody who still takes it seriously has a serious problem.
Yeah. That's what
and I think that's really important. And science has definitely done that but there are different levels. And people are in this audience. Some of them may be spiritual. They say, "Oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual." I never know what that means. But there are people who would say, "Well, I think there's some purpose to the universe. I don't believe in the world's religion. There's some purpose." And I think it is an overstatement to say that there is none. What we can say is there's absolutely no evidence of purpose to the universe. But what we can say, and what I think is really important, is that science is inconsistent with every religion in the world. That every organized religion based on scripture and doctrine, that is inconsistent with science. So they're all garbage and nonsense.
Right.
That you can say with definitive authority. I don't like to use the word authority. But the idea of purpose, vague purpose, all I can say is there's no evidence for it, and every bit of evidence suggests that it isn't there.
Yes.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right. Yes.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right. Yes.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right. Yes.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right. Yes.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right. Yes.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right. Yes.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right.